I'm going to walk through the steps of sharpening your chisels with Waterstones. I've got Norton and King stones here, so I have a King 800 and 1200 grit stone and a Norton 4000 and 8000 grit stones. You can use the King 1000, that's going to work just fine. That's the least expensive way to go. 800, 1200 is what I have used historically for quite a while. With the 4000, 8000, that could be a combination stone. I happen to have two different stones for that, and you'll see the 4000 wears pretty quickly and there's not much of mine left. My sharpening station, I've got the bench ready to go here. I've got a bucket of water down below, and I've got a spray bottle here. I've got a rag. I might want to have paper towels kicking around. You need something to dry your hands off, dry the tools off. In the shop at school, we want to make sure we put newspaper on the floor. It makes it much easier to clean up after you're done. So lift up the legs of your bench and put 2 or 3 sheets of newspaper under your bench. That really helps with cleanup. Once you're set up, the first thing you want to do is soak your stones. The typical Waterstones need to be soaked in water probably at least 10 minutes before you want to use them. When you first put them in the water, they're going to fizz and bubble, and after about 10 minutes, maybe 15 at the most, that bubbling has pretty much stopped and they're ready to use. I keep my stones in water all the time. In fact, I have not touched them since March, and they're fine. There are some stones where the manufacturer recommends that you don't store them in water, but I've never had any issues with the King and the Norton stones. Okay, once they're soaked, ready to go, we need to make sure they're flat. If they're new or you haven't used them in a while, you might want to check. But particularly if they're new, they're not going to be nice and flat, so we need to flatten them. So I've got a granite surface plate here. I've got some 150 grit wet or dry paper. 180 would work, 240 might work. Don't think I'd go coarser than 150 unless I really had nothing else to work with. I'm going to take my spray bottle, get this surface plate wet the back of the paper, and that'll kind of help it hold down. It will want to curl up a little bit at some point. Let's wet that. And what I want to do now is rub this on here. Now, if your stone's new, it's going to have the manufacturer's writing on here, on the King stone. And basically, you just want to rub it on here until that writing goes away, right? That's going to tell you that your stones are flat. On the other side, there's no writing, and you do want to flatten both sides. You can put some pencil lines on there. That sometimes helps, although sometimes the pencil lines wash off right away. Now, my stones are already flat. I put them away flat every time. So this won't take long. I'll just kind of make sure everything's good here. So that's my 800. This is my 1200. And if there's some dark, like on this side, there's some dark areas there. Apparently I didn't flatten this last time. Man, that feels a little different, but there, that quickly flattens up. I think that's done. I can rinse this in my bucket. I've got a bucket of water here. Yeah, a little bit of a spot there. This is my 4000. You can see it's gotten really thin. The 4000 is fairly soft. And being white, it's a little easier to tell if it's flat. So you can see, I can still see some streaks there. So it's probably needs a little more. So that looks pretty good. Probably should rinse this paper. You can see it does curl after a little bit. So this stone's probably going to break at some point. I'll need to replace it. So that looks great. Okay, so I'm ready to go. Oh, one more thing. when you flatten your stones, this edge or corner is going to get sharp. You know, you've got two planes. It's a good idea to knock those corners down just a little bit once in a while, because if you leave them sharp, you can actually cut yourself. You know, it's a sharp edge and it's abrasive, so it can be kind of nasty. So knock those edges down. The rest of these are pretty good. Okay, so we're ready to start flattening the face of the chisel. Before I start working on the face, which is this surface here, I want to get a sense of how flat it is. Now, it turns out this chisel had a little bit of a belly to it. It was actually convex. So I've took this to my diamond stone. I took it to a coarse, this is an extra coarse DMT stone, extra coarse. It took me about 10 or 15 minutes on the extra coarse than the coarse side to get this flat. Ideally, you would not have to do that, but you can kind of get a sense of it by taking a straight edge and holding it up against there and seeing, you know, maybe holding it up to the light to get a sense of what you're dealing with. Hopefully it's really flat or maybe slightly concave. We can live with either of those. Convex is a little more troublesome. We really need to get that belly out of there, and that's by far easiest done with diamond stones. So I'm pretty confident it's pretty flat, so I'm going to go to my coarsest stone now. I'm going to be working the face. Now it looks pretty shiny right now. It's actually going to get dull before it gets shiny again. I want that polish, but it's shiny now because of the diamond stone. So what I want to do is keep my fingers on top of the chisel. Don't grab the chisel like this. I can guarantee you if you grab the handle or grab it like that, you're going to lift a little bit. You're going to take off too much material off the tip of the chisel, and you're going to create that convex or that belly shape there. Want to avoid that at all costs. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to keep my fingers on top and just move the chisel back and forth. Now I want to look and see what's happening. I can see it's dark here and not quite hitting there. So it looks like this actually has a little bit, yeah, it does have now it's got a little bit of a hollow to it, which is fine. I'd rather have that. I can see it's hitting at the tip and it's hitting back in here. Now, I really want to avoid coming back here too far. You know, if you're working with a chisel like this, where there's actually a step here, you definitely want to avoid that area, because if you were sharpening this and went too far forward, it would lift the chisel up, hit the tip more, and you'd really have problems there. Basically, try to stay below the shoulder of the chisel. So lots of downward pressure. I sometimes put my little finger over here to keep the chisel from swinging around. I want to be, you know, off the stone in this direction, so I have maybe an inch. And then as I go back and forth, I'm going to come on the stone, right, and then off. Want to use as much of the stone as possible. If I continue to make full strokes, I'm going to create a hollow in the stone. So what I like to do is work the tip and then the middle of the stone and then this back third. So I'll work it in thirds. That tends to wear it a little more evenly. I'm going to rinse that off. I'm going to turn it around. Remember, I'm really being careful about not letting that get too out of flat. Now when you pick the chisel up, make sure you lift it up vertically. It's almost better to kind of pry it off and then lift it. What you definitely want to avoid is sliding the chisel off. If you do that, you're going to round the last tip that comes off of there. So let's take a look here. It looks like it's shinier here than back here. And I'm not too concerned about that because the sheen of the chisel is dull all the way through. And what I think is happening there, and this you'll sometimes see this depending on the chisel, I think is from here forward is heat treated differently than from here back. I'm guessing this is the harder metal at the front because I know I can tell because that's nice and flat in terms of sheen consistently. I think I'm hitting that whole surface. So what's causing the discoloration between the front and back is a heat treating situation. So I want to flatten my stone. Basically I want to flatten it every couple of minutes. You have to do this often. Now I could go back to the surface plate with sandpaper, but I've got a flat surface on the other side. So I'm just going to rinse that, turn it over, and we'll go a little more here just to make sure everything looks okay. I'm going to lighten up on the force that I'm pushing down a little bit. That makes the scratches from the stone a little less deep. I want to turn the stone around once in a while. So I'm getting pretty consistent coloration here, so that's telling me things are pretty flat. Stop, pry it up. That's looking really good. Now, like I said, I could go back to the surface plate with the sandpaper, but what I can do instead is use my other stone to flatten this. Now, I can do this because I've got two stones that are somewhat similar in grit. And so this works. It's not a great solution. You do have to be careful. Now, so as I go back and forth, I could feel it kind of click, click. That tells me that, the stone wasn't quite flat. If you're not careful and you let your stones get too out of flat, you can actually create one stone that's concave and the other stone that's convex, because you're just doing, the surfaces such that you're never going to totally get them flat. So stone against stone works, but you really have to be careful about it. So I'm going to now switch. This is my 1200. Rinse that. I should point out at the end of the sharpening session when we dump the buckets out, do not dump those in a sink because all that silt left over from that comes off the stone is going to plug up the drain, the trap in a sink. So we always dump the bucket outside. So it's 1200. Now, if I had been using my 1000 grit stone for all of this, I'd basically be done with the king stone. So I'm lightening up on the pressure, just trying to move around the stone, even out the wear. That's looking great. Starting to see a little more sheen there. It's still fairly consistent though, and you're going to get a higher sheen where the metal's harder. But that's looking good. I'm just going to turn this around. And another thing we can do sometimes is just rinse the stone off like that. I should also point out, I would normally be very careful, particularly if we're at school, about putting wet things on a bench. Avoid that. I'm in my shop here. Normally I don't even sharpen here. I sharpen in a different area. So I think that's looking really good. So quick flatten here. You can see I use this bucket often. It's really helpful to have water right here. Okay, good idea to put your stones away flat. Okay, here's my skinny 4000. Now, what you might find is this stone tends to slide around sometimes, depending on the situation and the particular bench. You might want to put a paper towel down. that sometimes kind of helps things stick a little better. I've seen some people put down that kind of padded anti-slip stuff that we use on the sanding downdraft tables. I would not do that because has a little too much give to it, and that can kind of mess up your chisels if you're not careful. Okay, just like before. Yeah, see how I'm getting a nice wide surface there? That tells me this is pretty flat. That's great. Yeah, once again, I'm coming off, almost an inch off, and then back on, not going past the shoulder. Prying the chisel off every time. I'm going to rinse it. Turn that around, and if your stone's starting to get a little dry, let's just squirt some water on it. Okay, so I'm very happy with that. Now, like I said, that color difference might throw some people off, but the sheen is very consistent. What can happen if you've got a little bit of a belly on the chisel, if it's concave, it's going to hit differently at the front and the back, and you'll see some inconsistencies in the sheen. That's something that takes a little practice to see, but that looks great. I'm going to go to the 8,000 grit stone now. Like that, nice even pattern there. This stone, like all stones, they all have a personality. And you need to figure out, what your stone is telling you. So I know that this Norton 8000, if I keep it really wet, I'll never get a polish. Okay, so some stones need to be super wet to get a polish. This stone needs to get dry to get a polish. And you can see it's getting dry, and I'm starting to get a nice polish there. This is going to look great. Let me turn this around, make sure I'm keeping the wear even. Wipe that off. Okay, and I'm not sure that's showing up on camera, but that is definitely, it's going to be more polished where it's harder. So it's pretty polished there, and it's still looking good over here, but the tip is really looking great. Now I'm going to see if I can get a little better, but I'm going to need to let the stone really dry out. It almost has to get black there. And it's a little tricky. As it gets darker, the chisel tends to stick more, particularly wider chisels. So you have to really be careful here. Once again, you just need to figure out your particular stone. But see how that's getting dark? That's going to help me get a nice polish. So that looks great. It's a little hard because that's such a small surface, but if I hold that right, I can see a little bit of my reflection there. So that looks good. We'll move on to the bevel. I want to put the chisel inside the square edge jig or the chisel holder. It shows some arrows here telling you to push the chisel to the right. Now I can't get it in right now, so I need to loosen up these, and I want to loosen them up evenly so that gap stays consistent inside there. So chisel goes in. I'm going to move it to the right, just like it says, and then tighten that up. And I want to sight through here and see if that gap is equal. So that looks pretty consistent. Now, this knob gets much tighter much more quickly than this knob, because this knob is right next to the chisel. This one's a long ways away. So if you really snug this one down, you're just going to bend this thing. So this one needs to be tight, and this one just barely snug. It's hardly doing anything over here. Next thing I want to do is slide the holder onto the bar here. Now the bar goes up and down, and particularly for a short chisel, I want the bar as low as possible. So I'm going to loosen these up, and depending on your Tormac, it may or may not have this wheel. This one, I'm going to lower that. I can just unscrew that, and that drops down, and I'm maybe a little more than a 1/16 off of there, because this is a fairly short chisel. A little longer chisel, you might want an 1/8 of an inch gap there. So I'm going to tighten those up. Now, I want to check the bevel angle on my chisel, and I'm guessing it's somewhere near 25 degrees. That's closer to 30, so that's fine. In general, I probably don't want to be over 30, so that looks pretty close to 30. So I want to keep that bevel angle, so that's why I want to see what it is. So I'm going to sight underneath here and move the chisel forward or back to get the angle correct. So right now it's hitting at the tip. So to get it hitting more in the middle here, I need to move the chisel forward. So I'm going to loosen that a little bit, move it forward, and then sight again. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now I'm doing that with the wheel off. So now I'm going to turn the wheel on, and we'll try it and see. Now when you're doing this, you need to be pushing down. There's usually a little bit of play in these bushings. And if you just grab it like this and go, you're going to be kind of moving around a little bit, and you're not going to get a consistent grind. So what I find works best is if you can push down right here, push down here, and push down here, you're going to get very consistent results. Now that's not very comfortable, so what I would typically recommend is squeezing between here and here. So depending on your height and how comfortable you are, you might want to do it like that, or you might want to do it like that. I'm a little taller, so I grab it like that. My right finger goes on there, and I'm just going to move it back and forth while the wheel's spinning. So let's see how that looks. Okay, and I want to take a look. Now, when you pull this off, don't immediately turn it back, because if you turn it this way, this water, which always ends up there, is going to go back underneath there. And if you're grinding for any length of time, you might end up rusting your chisel inside there. So I always shake it off a little bit first, maybe even wipe it off, and then I look and see. And that looks like I'm hitting, I had it sticking out the right amount. If I had it out too far, it would hit towards the back. If I didn't have it out far enough, it would hit towards the front. But that's hitting consistently. Now it is hitting on this side. So what I like to do, that's the right side like this, but when I turn it over, it's the left side. So it's a little hard to tell what's happening yet, but if I wanted to even that out, I would turn the chisel this way. I want to get this edge closer to the wheel, so I need to turn it like that. I think it's a little early to do that. I'm going to grind a little further. The main thing I was doing right now is making sure it's out the right amount. Okay. Gonna shake off the water, take a look there. So that's looking nice. So I've done the whole surface, and it looks very consistent. It's all the same color. You don't want, if you're moving it or you're not doing something right, you'll see, kind of different facets on there, but that looks great. Now I want to check and see if it's square. So I'm going to take my little chisel here, and I can stick the blade inside there and then do that. And so it's slightly out of square. This side is slightly higher than this side. So I need to take more off of this side, which is this right side when I've got it right side up. And so what I'm going to do, remember it's up against this stop inside here right now. So if I want to take more off of this side, I need to bring this side closer, which means I need to turn the chisel like that. So I'm going to keep it up against this reference here, but I want a little gap over here. So I'm going to hold it like this, so I'm squeezing that direction. I can loosen that and nothing goes anywhere. And now I can just put a little bit of a gap there, snug that back up, and I'll continue. Okay, probably done. Once again, that's nice and clean. I've done the whole surface. And I don't see, yeah, there's no sign of a flat there. I've ground all the way down. So that looks great. So I'll take the chisel out of the holder. I'm going to start with in my case, my 1200 grit stone. If I just had the 1000, you certainly start with that. I don't have much material to remove front and back to get a sharp bevel there. So what I want to do, find where that hollow is hitting front and back. The way I like to do this, I'm going to put my index finger over the bevel. I'm using my middle finger and my thumb to hold up the back of the chisel here, because I really want to make sure I'm flat on those 2 points there. And I'm going to pull the chisel back. Now, like I said, because this has just been hollow ground, there's very little material to remove to get a little flat there. So it's only going to take a couple of passes here. I'm actually going to take my left hand, I'm going to put a little more pressure at the tip there, and I'm going to slide the chisel back. Now if I take a look there, yeah, actually that looks pretty good. It's nice, even. It's about, I don't know, maybe a 64th wide. I don't want to go too wide here because I want, the smaller that is, the more resharpenings I'm going to get. So I'm going to leave it at that. That looks good. It's my 4000. Let's rinse that. Now, because I store my stones all together, it's a good idea to rinse off the stone because there might be some coarser grit. So same thing. Find those flats. A little extra pressure here. One thing that can be helpful if you have difficulty keeping that flat, and it definitely takes some practice to do that, keep your upper body, basically from your waist up, keep that locked. So if I hold that, do that, I'm going to kind of tuck my elbows in a little bit, and I'm not going to move my arms. I'm just moving my legs. And that makes it much easier to be consistent with the pressure. Now, if you see some chattering or feel some chattering here, that means you have too much pressure at this end. It's dragging a little bit, bouncing. That means you need to just increase the pressure at the tip. Ideally, don't lift it. It's a subtle thing. This definitely takes some practice. So I'm hitting in that right spot. And when I wipe this, I don't want to take my cloth and just wipe it off from my paper towel, because what's happening as we're honing, we're kind of pushing material off the edge there, and you don't want to tear it off. So if you're going to wipe it off, just wipe it away from the edge. And that's looking pretty good. It's a touch wider on this side. So when I go to the next grid, I'm going to put a little more pressure on this left side here. So that's good. That's fine. So now we're at the 8000. A little more pressure on this left side. I'm going to move my finger over it a bit. Same thing. And you can see there, I'm putting more pressure on that side. that's evening things out a little bit there. Okay, now because we're just pulling, we've pushed material off the edge there. So I'm going to go back and forth a couple of times here. Just kind of moderate pressure. See if we can kind of hone that edge to get rid of any little bit of metal that's hanging off there. So lighter pressure each time. Light pressure. Okay, now I've done that 2 or 3 times. I'm confident I've gotten rid of any little bit of metal there, so now I'll wipe it off. Nice dry cloth there. I've got a nice polish there. Got a nice polish there. That looks great. There are times, depending on your particular chisel, where this edge can get very sharp. It's just the nature of flattening this and the edges being nice and sharp and square. You might want to, on either your 8,000 or 4,000, just lightly hit those corners a little bit. It doesn't take much at all to knock that edge off. If you don't do that, probably be fine, but what you may find later is you're paring, you'll find that you make cuts on the edge of your hand. You'll wonder, how did I get those cuts there? And that's from those edges. But that looks great. That's a nice sharp chisel, and we're good to go.